Good evening, intelligentsia. I'm Mark Evanier. You know, the most interesting gain of these talks I'm doing, these little interviews I'm doing with friends of mine, from the email indicates that I am teaching people how to pronounce my last name. I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from people who said, I didn't know that it was Evanier. I thought it was Evanier or French or something like that. Actually, it was an Israeli name. And when my father's father, came to the United States, he landed at Ellis Island, and some anti-Semitic official saw him coming and said, hey, let's give this Jew a really stupid last name. And we all got stuck with Evanier. But the great part of it for me is I get to talk to people who I like, people who I have something to say to, and people I would enjoy talking to anyway. Tonight, I'm going to be talking for a while with my friend Paul Levitz. I've known Paul for a long time. We will be reminiscing about the first times we met and where we were in our respective lives at the time. I got to tell you that in the early 70s, I got into comic books the year that people say the Silver Age ended, which was 1970. There's a lot of markers of when the Silver Age ended. People say, well, when Jack Kirby left Marvel, that's when the Silver Age ended. Or when Marvel published the first Conan, that's when the Silver Age ended. I got to tell you, what it was when I got into the business, the Silver Age ended. That was it. And I got into the business not necessarily wanting my whole life to do it. I grew up reading comics. I loved comic books. I always had more than anyone I knew. But I didn't think there was a place for me to have a career in comics for a long time. And I wasn't sure I wanted one. Because when I read things about the comic book industry, I read a lot of very sad things. The first person I ever met who actually worked in comics was an artist that many of you have not heard of. His name was Ken Landau. He's a guy who worked for Gold Key Comics. He worked for ACG. He worked for a lot of the smaller publishers in the 50s. And he was very down on comics as a way to make a living. He didn't think the business treated people very well. And in the period when he was drawing and writing, drawing comics, that was probably very true. The next person I met was Jerry Siegel, the creator of Superman. I call him that because he introduced himself as Jerry Siegel, the creator of Superman. If his wife had been with him, he would have said, this is Mrs. Siegel, the creator of Superman. Jerry was very proud, understandably, of his contribution to comics. And at that point, that was kind of all he'd gotten out of it, was that pride. He wasn't living very well financially. He was very bitter. He was very unhappy with the way he had been treated by DC Comics and by some other people. Then I met Bob Kane, who was Bob Kane. We could do hours of Bob Kane stories. I didn't take him as indicative of how the industry was or anything. And then I met Jack Kirby. And Jack was this lovely, wonderful man, but he was very down on comics as a career. He did not encourage me to get into the field. And I was thinking I wasn't going to get into the field because I lived in Los Angeles and the business was based in New York. And I looked at Jack and I thought, gee, he's the most successful artist who's ever been in comics in terms of making money for your publisher. And he's not that happy with his income. He's not that happy the way he was treated or the way he was credited. And I thought, well, if Jack Kirby can't be happy working in comics, what chance have I got? So I kind of got in by accident, but all the time I was thinking, this is not a business that I want to stay in. It's not a business I want to make my main living in. And it's not a business that treated some of my favorite writers and artists very well. And in the business, I saw that change. Over the years, I saw that change. I saw a lot of things that the industry said we will never do for the talent. We will never pay them this way. We will never give them back we'll never give the artists back the original art. We will never give people a royalty of any sort. We'll never pay for reprints. I saw all those things happen. And I saw it become a much more livable industry. I believe the comic book industry is alive today, to the extent it is at all, because they made the business more humane, more mature, more business-like. And one of the people who made it that way was Paul Levitz. Paul will be embarrassed by some of the things I would say about him, so I won't say all of them here. But I have a very vivid memory I want to share with you. It's a very important memory to me. About 4 weeks before Jerry Siegel died in 1996, I had dinner with him and his wife, Joanne, and we had this lovely, wonderful dinner. And Jerry, who when I first knew him in 1969, could not go 10 minutes without looking like Bruce Banner turning into the Hulk, talking about what the business had done to him. I'm hearing Paul laughing in the background here. He was at great peace. He was a very happy man. He was, in his old age, he was very contented. And I remember sitting with him in his apartment in Marina Del Rey, at a condo in Marina Del Rey, a very lovely apartment, not a mansion, but a very comfortable place to live one's retirement. And it was a dignified place. He wasn't embarrassed by the way he was, his level of poverty during some of the years when he was alienated from Superman. He was getting his credit on Superman. He was getting paid on Superman. And he said to me, sitting there, this is a memory I will never forget, in his living room, he was sitting next to, there was a framed stamp. They had done a Superman stamp in Canada, and Bill Clinton, the president of the United States, didn't matter which one it was, the president of the United States had sent him a lovely letter congratulating him, and it looked like it was one of those real letters, not one of the auto pen ones. And he was so proud. There was the Superman was on a postage stamp. Even never mind that it was Canadian, it was a postage stamp. And Jerry was sitting there so serene and so calm, and he turned to me and he said, "We have Paul Levitz to thank for all this." And I never thought I would see the day when Jerry Siegel would say something nice about an important person high up in the hierarchy of DC Comics. And that meant an awful lot to me. And I will tell that story about Paul every place I can, whether he likes it or not, because to me, that is one of the great stories of comics that you must hear, that Jerry Siegel lived long enough to feel at peace, to feel he was taken care of, that he was appreciated, and to not worry about paying the rent. Anyway, here's my friend Paul Levitz. Let's bring Paul in here. Hi, Paul. I'm sorry if that story embarrasses you, but I'm going to tell it whether you like it or not. I
valued developing a friendship with Jerry and Joanne, their daughter Laura, tremendously. I was very happy that he was comfortable with how we were dealing with him in his lifetime. Yeah, as it should have been.
And I'll just append here that Paul very quietly helped out a lot of veteran comic creators for no other reason than that it was the right thing to do. And I think he also made the point to the industry that sometimes the right thing to do is good business. You don't do it because it's good business, but it becomes that if you keep doing the humane thing to do and the right thing in terms of maybe righting past wrongs or trying to undo some of the past damages that have been done. Now let's talk about DC Comics. The very first DC comic that I ever read was Action Comics number 250. Paul, would you lean slightly to your left for a second? I'm going to lean slightly to my right, and we're going to put up here the cover of, this is the cover of Action Comics number 250, the first DC book I read. I grew up on Funny Animal comics, and I would go to the secondhand bookshops where at the time you could buy 6, if they were 5 cents a piece, 6 for a quarter. So naturally, being a kid whose money was sparse, I always bought them in multiples of 6. And one day I found every Funny Animal comic I wanted, and I had one more comic for free. So I picked up this because it kind of reminded me of the Superman TV show I was watching. It was that could have been George Reeves taking the lie detector test in that scene there. And I liked it a lot. It was an old comic at the time. By this point, Supergirl had already taken over in the back of Action Comics. This was number 250, and she started at number 252. And I just started reading DC Comics after that and collecting as many as I could, and I liked this a lot. Meanwhile, you started with 50 issues later, Action Comics number 300. What do you remember about this book?
I remember my babysitter giving it to me. I guess I was probably 6 years old at the time. And I remember reading it, enjoying it. And I remember it had a subscription ad in it that you could get a year of the comic for $1, 12 issues for $1. And I somehow or other managed to talk my folks, particularly, I guess, my mother, who was the more nervous one about my reading comics, into letting me get a subscription. And that really led me down the path to the 40,000 of them that are sitting here now.
We get accused, people like you and me get accused of sometimes trying to drag comic books back to the way they were when we first started reading them. Did you feel, did you ever do that? Did you ever feel like you were trying to turn, when you were writing comics or editing comics or publishing comics, that you were doing something to try to recapture the comic book industry of your youth?
There's one project that I'm playing with writing now that hasn't been scheduled or announced, that's very deliberately a retro project where if it ever gets finished after all of this virus craziness and lockdown get themselves sorted out, it will be a moment in 1965. But overall, no, because look, there's an awful lot about comics that have mutated and changed away from what I loved as a kid. But what I loved as a kid is sitting there in my bound volumes, and I can go back and read them and remember where I bought them and how it felt to be in that candy store or on that street corner with the waterfall rack in front of me, trying to decide which of the things had the most fun cover. But it's a different generation now. They want different things. Some of it, I think, is magnificently done. Some of it, I think, is not so magnificently done. Some of it baffles me. But they should have their flavor. No reason why everybody has to continue with the flavor that I liked the ice cream at Carvel in 1966. If there's a new flavor that's come out that they like better.
Now, you were collecting comics and reading them. Tell us about a publication called Etc.
So when I was 14, I had discovered fanzines already. I found Mark Hannerfeld's On the Drawing Board / The Comic Reader that he'd published intermittently, but Mark had stopped publishing it by that point. The only fanzine that I could find that was giving any information about what was about to happen in comics was Don and Maggie Thompson's Newfangles. Now you have to realize that, Mark, but the audience may not. At that point, publishers weren't telling you what they were about to publish. I remember vividly going to the newsstand on my way home from high school one day, idly looking at the magazine side of the rack. It wasn't something I usually bought a lot from. And there was this thing, Savage Tales. Marvel had just spontaneously, seemingly generated this out of nowhere, with some really interesting material in it. Don and Maggie's zine was about the only thing that would give you any warning of what was about to happen. And they announced at the beginning of 71, at that point, they were a young married couple. They had a lot of things going on in their life. And they just said, look, we have to give this up. We're going to give it up at the end of the year. We're not taking subscriptions past December. You can order as many issues towards that as you want, but we're done with December. And I was sitting around with Paul Kupperberg, dear friend of mine, and we're not going to know what's going on. And we threw together $16 and started our own little fanzine, Etc. Called DC, got through to Nelson Bridwell, who was one of, if not the first comic fan turned professional in the offices of one of the major companies. Nelson gave us a certain amount of information. They sent us some, I guess, basic marketing materials that they were creating for their retailers and their distributors at the time. And we cobbled together a fanzine, tried to get through to Marvel. Wasn't as easy to get them to say anything yet at that point. And suddenly we were in the fanzine business. Over the next couple of months, we did a better job of reaching out to DC and Marvel, a little more thorough. And then Mark Hannerfeld turned around to me one day. By that point, Kupperberg had dropped out of being full-time on the zine. And Mark said, hey, you're doing what I set out to do, and I don't have the energy to do it. And he handed me this manila envelope full of people's quarters and nickels and the index cards he used to keep track of people's addresses and subscriptions, and said, "Here, why don't you do it?" So suddenly at 14 years old, I was doing one of the 2 or 3 largest fanzines around and the largest of the newszines.
Okay. Now, were you going up to the DC offices at this point?
Yeah, at that point, I was able to go up to DC, and I think by that point I was allowed up to Marvel for the first time. I didn't have the same freedom at Marvel, but Marvel was a tiny office at that point. There were probably 5 people, 6 people working there.
What year is this now we're talking?
71.
Okay.
You know, there was usually Stan, Roy, usually 1, maybe 2 assistant editors.
Well, I remember I was in that office in 1970 at Marvel, and you went down the corridor, and on the left was this terrible photostat machine that Marie Severn had to work next to. They would literally arrest the company for making people breathe those fumes today. And on the right was Alan Brodsky, and then there's a cubicle that had John Romita, Tony Morellero, Herb Trimpe in it. And then you go back there, and there's Roy had a desk, and to the left was John Verpoorten, and to the right was Stan Lee's office. And he had an assistant someplace in there who fielded his phone calls, and that was about it.
Yep.
It was a pretty small office, and freelancers would sit in the waiting area, which was tiny. The whole place was tiny, and there was a big letter on the front door from Stan saying, "Hey, fans, we know you. Congratulations on finding us, but we're too busy to talk to you. Please don't come in." So, all right. And they gave you news, and at some point you segued to working for DC a little bit.
Well, so at that point, something like 95% of everyone who was working in American comics was in the New York metro area. You know, we're before FedEx, we're before digital files going back and forth. It was you and Chase Craig and, I don't know, 10.
Alex Toth was out here.
For Gold Key out there. And a couple of the grand old names. Jack had already moved to California. Toth had already moved to California. Toth wasn't really working in comics very much. He'd do a job every now and then, but he was making his living in animation, I think, at that point.
Alex it was like, I'll get fed up in animation and quit and do comics. I'll get fed up in comics and quit and do animation. He went back and forth, quitting. Sometimes he could even manage to quit both businesses in the same week. He was very good at that. And you started working with Joe Orlando, I believe, was the first.
So I'm walking through the halls one day in my senior year of high school, gathering my news. And Joe yells out to me to come in. And he says, "You want to write my letter columns?" I said, "I'm not a writer, Joe." He said, "I read you write fanzine. You write well enough to write a letter column." That's not exactly a very high bar. And I think I was the first warm body that walked past his office door after Marv quit doing his letter columns. And he was probably already late on them. But this was exciting. I would get $15 a letter column, and I'm a professional in the comics business. And I started doing the bullpen pages, the DC equivalent of them, shortly thereafter for Saul Harrison. And that summer, as I was about to graduate high school, Joe's then assistant, Michael Fleischer, announced he was going to take the summer off for an extended vacation. Joe asked, would I like to fill in? And I said, yeah, of course, love to. And I did, and Michael never came back. And he's fine. He was fine. He went off. He wrote a lot of comics, then got his PhD and worked for the UN, did some wonderfully interesting, weird shit in Africa before he died a couple of years ago. And there I was, 16 years old, and an assistant editor on the masthead with my name in the indicia of the comics. And I mean, it must have been breaking at least 3 different labor laws. But I didn't know that at that time. And B, if I had known, I certainly wouldn't have objected.
All right. Now, I would like to enter into evidence a piece that our friend Scott Edelman posted on Facebook the other day. This is an excerpt from the Comic Reader at the time. You wrote, next problem. To clarify all, the Paul Levitz is now working at DC Statements. I've been writing some text and letter pages for DC since January. If you consult page 4 of number 93, you'll notice that I told everyone about it long ago. Hey, there's another scoop for TCR. The only staff or punch the clock type work I'll be doing is when I fill in for Mike Fleischer this summer while he takes a protracted vacation. I have no desire to make a career for myself in this industry, so don't worry about my pro work hurting TCR. It's just a way to help pay for my college tuition.
You know, the comic book industry was dying. We all knew that. I was going to go to college. I did go to college. Ultimately, I would go up to DC 2-3 days a week to pay for the 2 days a week I would cram my college courses into. And I was going to get a real job.
What kind of a real job did you want to get?
By that point, I was assuming that I would get either a marketing or a management kind of business job, probably in what's now called the technology field. They didn't use that term at the time, but that companies like IBM were working with computers. I liked the scientific aspect, the tech aspect of things like that.
Okay. And of course, the question is, what went wrong? At what point did you go, wait a minute, I'm still in comics. Maybe I'll be staying for a while. How long? Yeah.
I took a what's called a case course. I was in a 5-year bachelor and master's business program at NYU. And one way they teach those courses is what's called the case method, where they give you I think it was heavily developed and promoted at Harvard. Harvard Business School is really famous for it. And they give you 10 or 30 page description of a company. There's a classic one that was done from Harvard a couple of years ago on how Marvel got in the movie business. It's the closest they've gotten to a real comic book case that I'm aware of. But anyway, they give you a case every week, and that's your homework. You've got to analyze it. You've got to, first of all, diagnose the problem correctly, and then come up with a rational course of action to try and deal with it. And it's considered one of the tougher business courses. So I'm leaving the class one day, headed out for the afternoon or the evening, whatever it was. And the teacher catches me. My memory is it was in an elevator, but I don't even remember if that building actually had an elevator. And he says, hey, every time you actually do a case, you know what you're doing. I really like to give you an A in this course, but you're not bothering to do some of the assignments. What's with this? And I said, well, I'm working in comics. I'm freelance writing as well as doing some staff work, and I think at the time I was making about $25,000 a year, doing well at it. Sometimes it's a case of being on deadline and making some money or getting the case done. I kind of figure, since I'm already making what most people do when they get their MBA, then I'm not going to get the job or not get the job based on what my grade point average was. And I remember very vividly Professor Arescu kind of shrugging his shoulders and saying, yeah, since you're out earning some of your teachers, I can understand that. And I got off the elevator and said, why am I doing this again? And figured out that I had enough money put away that if I needed to, I could go back and pay for the last year or so I needed of school. And I should give comics a try for a little while. It turned out to be a longer sentence than I expected, but eventually the parole board met.
Okay, that's fine. Now let's talk about DC Comics at this time. I first visited the DC offices, I think, before you did. I was up there in July of 1970. And it was a very life-changing experience in many ways for me to be there, having read all these comics for years. And I was always a person who was kind of more interested in Carmen Infantino and Gil Kane than in Superman and Batman. I was interested in the people who wrote and drew the comics, who created them, and when we get together to be quizzed about panels and things like that, Mark Waid can tell you what was in the comics better than I can, and I think I can tell you who wrote and drew them or lettered the backgrounds or whatever better than he can. But I met that first day I was up to the DC offices. I met Carmine. I met Saul Harrison. I met Murray Boltonoff, Joe Kubert, Julia Schwartz, Dick Giordano. That was the day I met Marv and Len. I met Marv Wolfman and Len Wein in the office that day and Mark Hannerfeld also. And I met Robert Kanigher. I met Murphy Anderson, all the guys in the production department, Jack Adler, Nelson Bridwell. I spent a lot of time with Nelson Bridwell, who was a fascinating man. I'm glad we gave him the Bill Finger Award last year. He still deserves more recognition than he ever got. And some of those people were very nice to me. Some of them were not. I was Jack Kirby's assistant. I was there with my friend Steve Sherman. We were Jack Kirby's assistants at the time. And from some of them, we got all this love they had from Jack. And from some of them, we got all this dislike they had for Marvel Comics and did not understand kind of why, since we all knew that all Marvel Comics were inferior to all DC Comics, why was DC bringing in a Marvel guy and giving him as much power as he had? It was very strange for me, and it struck me as a business that I didn't want to be in very much at that point because I didn't understand it. The offices felt way too corporate. The next day we went to Marvel, and people were there without ties on, and it wasn't as formal, and it was friendlier, a much friendlier atmosphere. But I kind of didn't like the company that was publishing my favorite comics. I got an eerie feeling about it. What was your impression of the company as it stood when you were there, not as a part of the company?
Well, of course, I didn't have a lot of frame of reference. You know, this was the first office I ever visited. These were the first professional people I knew. I grew up in a working class section of Brooklyn. You know, the people in the neighborhood were bus drivers and exterminators and clerks. Not, you know, the only professionals I knew were the doctor or the dentist that I got taken to as a child. So it was a very different experience. On the whole, they were extraordinarily friendly to me when I was a kid, which enabled my fanzines to work and was very kind to me. As I look back on it and as I moved to the inside of it and got more of a concrete feeling of it, there was an enormous disparity between the older guys and the handful of younger people. The younger people, the Lens, the Marvs, Mark, Mike Friedrich, were there en route to something else. They loved comics, but they knew comics wasn't going to be a good place to work. So Len and Marv would talk about, you know, we're going to move to California and we're going to write Laugh-In someday. The older people were praying that the business would last long enough for them to retire and get their pensions. And they were either dispirited by it, frustrated by it, confused by it. You know, it wasn't the business that they understood anymore. And that was a real challenge for them. And that would get stranger and worse over the next couple of years. And the place didn't really begin to change its culture until Jeanette Kahn arrived. You know, she kind of parachuted in as a 28-year-old, a woman, an outsider. It would have been slightly stranger if a Martian had arrived, but only slightly. And that really, I wouldn't have gone full-time at DC if it hadn't been for her arrival and the friendship we struck up and the collaborative working environment that she created. The rest of the place, the earlier version of the place had pretty much given up. I think Marvel knew the same problems of the business that DC did, but they were at least on an up curve of their own sales. And Stan had so much damn energy as a cheerleader that I imagine was infectious to a degree that, you know, no one was paying attention to the fact that the business was going to hell. Our business is a little bit better than it was last year. maybe everything's burning around us, but we're okay. But that, I think that was the heart of the difference between the places in the early 70s.
Let me tell you two anecdotes about my first days up at DC Comics in 1970. All right. One of them was I was delivering artwork. I had at that point met Alex Toth, I think, twice. Alex was living in Hollywood, right near the Hollywood Bowl, and I'd been up to see him twice. And he called me up the night before we were going. Steve and I were flying back to New York. We were going to spend a week in New York, going to the comic book company offices, and then spend time at what we then called the Suling Con, the 1970 New York Comic Convention. Mm-hmm. And Alex was drawing Hot Wheels for DC at the time, for Dick Giordano. Mm. And he was doing the issue, I believe it was number 5. It was an issue that Alex wrote, penciled, and inked, but did not letter. And it was an issue where he decided to divide all the pages into eighths, all equal panels, and he put black between the panels. Alex Toth fans will remember this issue. It was a very striking issue. It was an amazing issue of a comic that people otherwise might have overlooked. But he had done this. He put black between all the panels, and they were all the same size. And Alex called me up and said, "Will you deliver this to DC for me?" At that point, to get it back to DC, otherwise would have taken 3 or 4 days in the mail. And so he said, you're leaving tomorrow. Come pick it up tonight at my place and deliver it. So I carried back the artwork to that and delivered it to Dick Giordano, the editor. Later that day, a guy who was on staff, Sal Amendola, you remember Sal? He was on staff doing art corrections and such. He comes to me. No, it wasn't that day. It was a day or so later. They had given the story to John Costanza to letter because Alex had penciled and inked it, but he had left the balloons blank. He had penciled them roughly where the balloon should go. And John Costanza lettered, and then somebody had to go in and close up the space around the balloons where Alex had left too much space. They had to extend the black or extend the background details. You know how that's done. Mm-hmm. And then Sal Amendola came up to me and he said, they just told me to take the black out from between the panels, and they're not happy with the job. By they, he meant Saul Harrison and Jack Adler and people in that division. They're not happy with the job. Dick is fighting them, and Dick is losing the argument. And I've just been told to ignore Mr. Giordano, who's only the editor of the book, and to take the spaces out. They're really unhappy that Alex didn't change the composition, that he had every panel the same size and shape in the whole issue as kind of a discipline. And I said, that will ruin the page. Alex designed it with the blacks to go into the gutter. The black figures and the shapes in the panels merge into the gutter. It's beautifully designed. And Sal said, I know. And I said, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to wait till Neil gets here. Neil Adams was coming in late every afternoon. He'd walk in about 4 o'clock and say hello to everybody and talk to everybody. And then he'd sit in a little cubicle there and work on whatever he was working on for DC. And he'd stay there till 7 or 8 at night, I guess. And when he came in, I was introduced to him. And then Sal came in and we showed Neil the job, the Hot Wheels pages, the original art, and told and explained what Saul Harrison and Jack Adler and whoever else was in that division at that point wanted to do to it. And Neil said, give it to me. And he takes it and he goes into the office with them and he comes back out 10 minutes later and says, leave it just as it is. And I was impressed that the editor of the comic couldn't stop them from doing that, Dick, but Neil Adams, who had no official position at DC, he didn't have a title, he wasn't on staff, I don't think, was able to talk them out of it. And then later, Saul Harrison gave me this whole speech. He didn't like the fact that this was, he got talked out of it. I don't quite understand. I guess they went to Carmine or something like that, and Carmine sided with Neil, whatever. But Saul started explaining to me how the job of the editorial staff was to take the stuff the freelancers gave them and make it good. He regarded what Kurt Swan and those guys handed in as raw material and then the office would put the DC touch on it, and they would fix it, and they would improve it, and they would take the wonderful talents of Irv Novick, and they would do things on it to make it really good. Did you find that attitude at the company at that time, like I did, as market as it was?
I think Saul always viewed himself as being the art director, not the production manager or production director or whatever you want to define it as. He'd done some inking in his life. He'd done some lettering. He had an artistic sensibility, but he had very specific taste. And through most of the time from Shelley Mayer's retirement in 1947 to Carmine's ascendance into a senior position on staff in 1966 or so. So for about a 20-year period, there was no one with an artistic background on the editorial staff or the creative staff of DC Comics. It was a writer-driven team. So Saul, for lack of anybody else, was the most educated and informed voice about what good art was, about what would make something reproduce. And he was a man of strong opinions and the ability to present his opinions forcefully. He had real presence. And I don't think anyone argued with him. And he thought, as you were talking about Marvel, he was not a fan of the art in Marvel. Because if you look at the spectrum of superhero art and you say, to some extent, it goes between the poles of attempting to do realism or attempting to do great cartooning. And I would argue Jack veered more to the great cartooning than he did to the realism. Neil more to the realism than the great cartooning. Saul was a great believer in the realism side. He thought Kurt Swan, Cy Barry, Dan Barry were good artists because they knew how to draw a person. And I think he was a big fan of Neil's, seeing in Neil sort of a later generation version of all of that. And he was not a big fan of Jack's.
No, in fact, that first time I met Saul, he asked Steve and me, could you get Jack to draw more like Kurt Swan? Stop doing those stupid square fingertips. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to go back to California and tell Jack he's got to draw more like Kurt Swan.
I mean, Kurt was a wonderful artist. I don't mean to diminish him. Jack unquestionably was the most commercial artist comics had. But that wasn't Saul's particular taste, and production was a very strong force in all of that.
But it struck me as odd that now Dick Giordano, who had obviously a much better artistic background than Saul, was the editor of the book, and Saul was overruling him. And then Neil, who had no job at all there, was overruling. I guess Carmine was ultimately the authority on that at that time. But it just seemed very strange to me. And I was of the opinion, and maybe, I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, that the problem in comics, that bad artwork in comics or poor artwork in comics was as often the case of wrong casting as it was the skills of the artists. I think an awful lot of people were misused and misapplied. I have arguments sometimes with people. I come to the defense of Vince Colletta at times, me of all people, because people act like when he was inking Jack at Marvel, he was like forcing his way. He was grabbing the pages and running out and inking them with nobody asking him. Stan would hand him the pages and say, "Hey, do a great job like you always do, Vince." And Vince would hand the pages in, and Stan would say, "Great job, Vinny. Here's the next issue." But somehow, if people don't like Vince Colletta inking Jack Kirby, that's Vince Coletta's fault, not Stan Lee's fault.
Well, and to that point, we've talked about this before, but much of the audience may not have heard it. When Carmine hired Jack to do The Fourth World, He was giving Jack a very high rate at the time to write and to pencil. Completely appropriate and deserved, but the books were pretty expensive for new books. So he made a deal with Vinny that Vinny would get to ink all of Jack's stuff, but Vinny would have to take lower than his usual rate, $3 a page less, something like that, if I remember right, $4 a page less. So about a 20% cut to be doing this.
And it would actually, and that was a cut from his romance comic rate.
Yeah.
Because the romance comics were disappearing at that point. The romance comics were either being canceled or going largely reprint, and Vinny was losing his livelihood.
Right.
So giving Vinny the Jack's books solved two problems at once, because they liked Vinny personally, and they were happy with what he was doing, and also they had promised the work to Frank Giacoia, who remained very angry that he didn't get it, and they turned down Wally Wood, but Frank would have been a problem with deadlines probably, because he had those problems at times, and Vinny would never have been a problem with deadlines. In fact, Vinny inked everything overnight, or close to 2 or 3 days probably, even if it wasn't due. People keep saying, I think they have the idea that everything he inked was inked, or it wouldn't have gotten to the printer on time. Most of what he did was inked on normal deadlines, and he just handed it in fast. His editors were perfectly happy with it. Sometimes I think the question is not, why didn't Vinny spend more time on a page, but why did anybody else spend more time on a page? Why did Joe Sinnott spend as much time on a page as he did?
The amazing thing is that so many people in comics in those years did such great work when they were not being paid particularly well. They didn't have any share in the upside of the thing if in fact it sold well. And in many cases, they weren't being treated with a lot of respect. One of the reasons that the Marvel books at that time, I think, looked as good as they did by comparison, again, goes back to Stan being a cheerleader. One of my absolute favorite moment with Stan was a dinner we had.
Hamburger Hamlet,
probably. And he turns around to me in the middle of it, and the avatar goes off, which didn't often happen. And he said, Paul, Marvel's asking me to do more editorial work. I don't remember who was running Marvel or what the circumstance was, and it never came to pass, but still. He said, what does an editor do these days? I said, well, Stan, to all intents and purposes, I haven't been an editor pretty much as long as you haven't been an editor. This was, 15 years after I had stopped editing comics and 20 years after he had. I said, but look, the job of an editor still, in my view, has always been get the best work out of people. And we started talking about Archie Goodwin and Archie's amazing level of dexterity at doing that, using tools that I could never figure out other than that he was really a nice, incredibly decent human being. And he had clearly understood the material brilliantly. And I said, Stan said, I wasn't much of an editor. I just wrote all the stuff. I said, Stan, I worked with the guys you worked with, all of the guys you worked with. Don Heck was a lovely man, talented guy. You got the best work out of him.
He also cast him properly.
He cast him properly. Dick Ayers, terrific, decent human being, hardworking, as professional a human being as I've ever dealt with. You got him to do great stuff. I didn't. And Stan laughed and he started reminiscing about Dick, and he said, yeah, every time I sent Dick a job, he'd call up and say, what do you want me to do with this one, Chief? And the avatar flipped on. And it was full Stan Lee. And it was, well, Dick, it's a Western. He didn't remember what the name of the Western was. I want to see those hoofs flashing and those spurs shining. And I started laughing out loud. I said, that's how you did it, Stan. That's how you were a great editor. You got Dick excited about the thing with your cheerleading. He'd come into me. He'd have his little book. He'd tick off how many days it would be before he'd be back at 3 pages a day. And I'd say, he'd ask, you going to have something ready for me when I come in, Paul? And I'd say, that's when you're coming in. I'll have something ready for you, Dick. And we liked each other, and he'd bring me candy from his wife's work at the Lifesavers factory. But you got him excited, and I never got him excited, and that showed in his work.
Yeah, well, I had a few times with Stan Lee where he dropped being, capital S, capital L Stan Lee, and he was the person. And he said things I wish he had said in public. I wish people had seen, there's things I'm quoting he said in my book on Jack I'm working on now that he said to me, and I remember them absolutely vividly, but he would never have said them in front of a tape recorder. So I don't think people will believe he said them.
Yeah.
Things about Jack that it would have been very nice if he'd said them, like to the management at Marvel sometimes. But talking about treating the talent right, the other anecdote I want to tell you, I was sitting in Murray Boltonoff's office. This was, this is July of 1970. And we were interrupted because Bob Brown came in to deliver a Superboy job. Now, Bob Brown had been working for DC for 10 or 20 years at this point. He drew Challengers for a long time. He drew Space Ranger.
10 or 15, 10 or 12.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. He was a very sweet little nervous man, very polite, wanted to do well.
Very competent.
One of the things that I try to debunk with people or take is that there's this idea that if you didn't like the artwork in a comic, the artist wasn't trying. He just knocked it out fast. Some of the very few guys were knocking it out that fast. Some of them were really trying. Some of them weren't as good as others, and some of them were very miscast. I remember Bob Brown coming to me years later when he was drawing a Legion of Superheroes story, and he had no idea who the characters were. So whoever, I apologize if you were the editor at the time of this, but nope. He had not been given sufficient reference, and he said to me, he showed me. He showed me a drawing of Saturn Girl by somebody else. They had it in a comic. He said, "How old is this person? I don't know how old this character is. This girl 13? Is she 18? Is she 22? I can't tell from this comic, and I would like to know how old she is when I draw her." And he was really lost. Anyway, he was in there with Murray Boltonoff, and I was sitting there. Murray interrupted our conversations to receive Bob Brown. Murray had the check for the job already drawn. And he was sitting there going over the pages. I'm going to find a slip of paper here of something. Here we go. My Gardner bill. My Gardner bill will play the role of the check already made out to Murray Boltonoff for this job, and it made out to Bob Brown for this job. Murray Boltonoff, the editor, is sitting there looking at the pages, and he's going, "I don't know. I can't give you this check. I'm not sure. You really knocked this one out." And every Bob Brown job was the same level of quality. Bob did not have a worse job or a better. He did everything consistently, and he worked very hard in his work. And if it wasn't the most wonderful artwork in the world, that's because he was not the right guy, maybe for the assignment or something. And Boltonoff is waving this check, dangling it like, "I'm not sure I can give it to you." Well, okay. And finally, of course, it came down to Murray went, "Okay, listen, I'm going to give you the check," and he hands it to Bob. Bob reaches for it, and Murray pulls it back and says, "But you got to work on, spend more time on the next job and try harder." And he hands him the check, and then and Bob reaches for it, and he pulls it back, and he says, "Okay, now I may not give you the check next time. You better do a better job on this stuff." And finally, Bob Brown gets his check, and he says, "I'll try to work much harder in the future. I'm sorry that this wasn't up to my standard. I will try to do more time. Please, Murray, please. Thank you very much." And he walks out. And I thought, why was this man just put through this? 20 minutes later, I run into Bob Brown in the hallways, and I say to him, "I don't understand how you can be treated like that." And he said, "That's what Murray does all the time. He's been doing that for 15 years to me. I do that at every job. I have to go through that." And I thought, oh, there's something fundamentally wrong with this company. And there was this, and Murray Boltonoff was a good editor. I'm not putting him down. He did excellent comics. And I asked Julie Schwartz one time about that. I told him that story, and he said, "Yeah, that's the way they always liked us to treat the artists, keep them in their place. I couldn't do it all the time. Mort Weisinger was the master of it." you know, keep the guys feeling like they just barely qualify for their paycheck. And that bothered me an awful lot. It's one of the reasons I didn't do more work for DC when I was invited to do it. I didn't want to be part of the atmosphere. And I saw that change throughout the 70s. Nobody in the late 70s at DC, even Murray Boltinoff, did that to artists, as far as I could see. They treated them much, much better in general, overall. Julie Schwartz became kind of a pussycat as he went on. He was a different man near the end of his run as editor than he was at the beginning. Anyway, that was my observation then at that time.
You talk about Murray. In a lot of ways, he was the most commercial editor at DC after Weisinger retired. His mystery books outsold Joe Orlando's, outsold Dick Giordano's. I like Joe's or Dick's better creatively, but Murray had a real sense of the market and a real hard focus on what was going to attract the reader. I joke, I was very lucky as a young kid working in an office like that. I think there were about 8 or 9 people who ended up in the Eisner Hall of Fame out of a staff of 35. Tremendous place to learn. And I learned a lot about how to organize and manage an editorial office from Julie Schwartz, who never turned anything in late in his life and was very careful about giving the writers and artists their next assignment so they could work smoothly, so they could keep making a living, making sure the checks were ready. Even when he was a grumpier soul, he treated people professionally. I learned about how to get better creative work out of people from Joe Orlando, who was my direct boss. A lot of hands-on creative skills. My joking line about Murray is I learned how not to treat talent, that I never wanted to be like that. He wasn't happy. I mean, Murray had a more successful career before comics than most of the guys in the office. And I think he and Kanigher were the 2 people who really felt they'd taken a wrong turn in their careers in staying in comics. And by the time you're talking about, Murray's wife was having some major health issues. So I don't think he was having a great time in his personal life.
Well, he was very loyal to veteran artists and writers. He more than anyone else tried to keep people working who no other editor could find work for. And he was a little resistant to new talent. And so being that way, but I don't think that was a bad thing necessarily.
He very famously never wanted to publish anyone's first work.
Yes, that's right. Jerry Conway, accidentally published Jerry's first story, I think.
No, he accidentally bought Jerry's first story.
Oh, okay.
But he never published it.
Oh,
and I ended up getting it in inventory after Murray retired from doing those books and finally was able to publish it. Okay. Once he discovered it was Jerry's first story, that was unpublishable in his view. It just went to the bottom of the stack and sat there forever.
Okay. We've got a long way to go. We're not going to get through anywhere near the ground I wanted to cover in this, but we got some questions here. Scott Edelman, our friend Scott, wrote, "Hello, Mark. I look forward to learning when you 2 met, as I met Paul when he was 15 and I was 16. My recollection is that I was back in New York staying with Tony Isabella in an apartment in Brooklyn, a house he was renting with either Carl Gafford or Joe Jenkins or someone like that. And we went over, it was 2 blocks from where you were living, and we went over there and helped you with letter pages and fanzine stuff in your basement."
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
So that probably, I'm probably 15 at that time.
It was the year that it was the year at the New York Con when the big fuss was made about Heidi Saha, and Forrest Ackerman and Jim Warren had published this bizarre magazine about her that most of us bought and we were ashamed to have bought. I have a copy someplace here. But we were in your basement writing fake letters for some letter pages that didn't get any mail. I remember that. And that's what I remember.
So then if it's the letter columns, then it's probably 73.
That makes sense. Yeah. 73 would, I think, been the year I was up in the DC office just kind of hanging around. I don't think people knew who I was. Well, some people knew who I was, but I think people thought, oh, when was he hired? And I wasn't hired. I was just poaching up there hanging around. And someone brought in, we were in this office, maybe you were in this, somebody brought in the new Marvels, bundle of the current Marvels, the bag that gave out. And people were going through it, looking at it and saying, oh, look at that. Look at who's drawing that. Look who's drawing that, And I remember that I went through the same scene later in that day at Marvel, where people brought in the new DCs. And I remember Vinnie Coletta was in both groups. It was anyway. So we're all crammed in this little office, like the Junior Woodchucks, I guess, were at that time active. And I remember, and Denny O'Neil was in the office a bunch. And Saul Harrison pokes his head in and he says, "Why are you looking at those awful Marvels? They're terrible comics." And somebody says, "Oh, they have some really good people here. There's some really good people working at Marvel these days." And Saul Harrison says, this is almost verbatim. I have a good memory, as you may have heard. He says, "The best artist at Marvel is not as good as the worst artist at DC." And all the air went out of the room. And there's this uncomfortable thing. And somebody says, well, John Buscema, Gene Colan, he says those guys have a lot of talent. If we had them, we could make them into really great artists, but Marvel does not know what to do with them, and the work they're handing in is awful. And there's this gap here. And I was the only person in the room who was not working for DC, who could say this to Saul Harrison without being kicked out of the building. I said, so you're telling us that the Gil Kane art appearing in Marvel Comics is bad art, and the Gil Kane art appearing in DC Comics is good art? And without missing a beat, Saul says, yes, exactly that. Gil knows he can't get away with handing that shit into us.
I think part of what Saul wouldn't have been able to articulate this and wouldn't have understood it. But part of what made the difference was the difference between working in the Marvel method at that point and working off the full scripts. And I think one of the things that Saul defined as good art was the fact that because virtually all the DC work at that time, maybe with the exception of the stuff that a couple of the artist editors were writing and drawing themselves, Jack, Joe Kubert, virtually everything was done full script, and almost all of it by writers who had been brought up in the old-fashioned traditions. The DC Comics visually had much more of sort of stock set-piece panels. Superman's flying over Metropolis on patrol, meanwhile, as Superman flies over Metropolis. Whereas the Marvel stuff was looser, much more dynamic. The artists were going for playing for visual effect more because they had more control over the pages. And Saul didn't like that. He didn't believe in that as comics. He probably liked the Gold Key comics of the time more than he liked the Marvel comics, even though I think you and I would both agree that the Gold Key action or adventure kinds of titles, while there was some talented people working there, were rarely as well done as either the DC or the Marvel, partly because they weren't able to pay for as expensive talent, but partially also they tend to be very stiff, very vertical, very little camera work on it. And I think Saul really liked that world better.
I think without disagreeing with you, I think he also liked who published it better. And I think that was anyway. Let's go to a few more questions here. I want to not get. We've got a ridiculous number here backed up here. Lots of people are telling their stories about when they met you. Okay. Mark Murderosian, giving Jack a chance to redraw the Fourth World character so he could get royalties from the toys was a huge and nice gesture by Paul and Jeanette, who did not spell her name that way. Do you want to tell people what he's talking about?
So, again, ancient history. Circa the early 80s, there are no action figure lines based on comic book characters. Mego had been doing, if you want to call them action figures, but sort of those early dolls, but they've given up at that point. DC goes around, and we want to pitch both the leading companies at the time are Hasbro and Kenner. We want to pitch the line. We want to get a big licensing deal. And we're working creatively to do the development on it. One of the things that you would offer as a criticism of the DC line at that time, the DC mythology, if you will, was it had a weaker bench of villains than Marvel did. There were some interesting Batman villains, some interesting Flash villains. There weren't too many big bads that you could have facing an entire Justice League or serious cast compared to what Marvel had built up. So we came upon the idea of using Jack's Fourth World characters to do that, Darkseid being such a brilliant creation and the subsidiary Fourth World characters being interesting. There had been a lot of noise in the previous year or two about Jack's arguments with Marvel over his original art, which reminded us of sort of how frustrated he'd been in his time there. And I guess gave us extra sympathy for his situation. I mean, everybody loved Jack, everybody respected Jack, but that sort of had him front of mind.
Not everybody loved Jack, but most people love Jack.
I would settle for half the proportion of the human race that he had.
Yes.
I had at that point just used Darkseid, I think, in the Great Darkness saga, because I was such an enormous fan of that material. And we had at that point started to give royalties on new character creation to talent, but we weren't able to get the okay, or we hadn't worked out to backdate it from before Jeanette got there. So you had to, it was for creations that started in 1976. So I don't remember which of us came up with the thought. Could have been Jeanette, could have been me, could have been Joe Orlando, who would also have been working on that material at the time, that why don't we get Jack to do a little bit of new development work on these characters, make the costumes, a version of the costumes more suitable for action figures because they can't pick up the same level of detail. And we can pay him a few bucks, but we can use that as an excuse to be able to give him some royalties on this. And we reached out to Jack and Roz, negotiated out a deal to do that. This was money we hadn't made yet. It would help us do the deal with Kenner or Hasbro. It ended up being Kenner that won the rights. We thought it would make the line more successful. And I took a great deal of pleasure in ensuing years, the number of times Jack pointed out he'd made more money off Darkseid and those guys than he made off all the Marvel characters put together in terms of residuals. Ultimately, it seemed his kids did pretty nicely off the Marvel stuff, thankfully.
Yes.
But at least in his lifetime, and these were not phenomenal checks, but we used Darkseid in the Super Friends TV shows, the Super Powers TV shows, partly to promote the toy line. We sold a fair number of toys, and we wrote some decent checks to Jack, and it made him happy, and that certainly made me happy. I think it certainly made Jeanette happy.
One of the themes of this whole conversation for me, and I alluded to this earlier, is this whole thing where, in one day they say, we'll never do that. And then 20 years later, they do it. And Jack used to say Jack would say to Carmine or to anybody in the comics, here's how the business has to change. And they'd say, we won't do that. And they've done every single thing he said they should do. There was a guy with Licensing Corporation of America in 1971 or 72, whatever the Disneyland Comic Convention was. He came out, and I was sitting in a room with him and with Carmine and with Jack, and he was explaining to us, this LCA guy was explaining to us, no one will ever merchandise the New Gods characters. Why would anybody buy your characters when they can come to us and get Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman? These characters will never be on TV. They will never be in the movies. They will never be on T-shirts. They will never be on toy shops. And I have this kind of smug feeling of satisfaction that how wrong that guy was. An awful lot of the business has changed so much. It is just amazing to me, all these things, and I should be documenting them more than I am. But and actually, this book I'm writing about Jack, this new book, I think I cover a lot of that. But it is a change that I think was just so important to comics, to start treating the talent better. Anyway, Stephen Commander wants to know, Paul, did Marv Wolfman show you how to use a word processor after Mark showed him how? I taught Marv how to use a computer and to use a word processor. I don't think he taught you anything about that.
No, I suspect I was using a computer before Marv.
Mm-hmm. Jerry Conway was using one before I was, I remember.
I mean, I learned to program computers on a mainframe when I was 13, 12, something like that, in junior high school, 13 probably. So I was always very comfortable with computers.
Yeah. Did you know that I was the very first person to ever send a package to DC by Federal Express?
I didn't. If I knew it at the time, I didn't remember it now.
Steve Gerber was the first person to ever deliver a script by MCI mail, which is what we had in the early days of computers. It's called MCI mail, where they would print it out in New York. He could send the script to MCI mail, and they would print out in New York and messenger to your office. And he delivered a script that way. And a couple months later, I delivered an issue of Black Hawk. Maybe it was more than a couple months, to DC that way. And Pat Bastian called me up and she said, how did you send this? Where did you mail this? She was horrified at that. It was it's probably my biggest contribution to comics, I think. Let's see. It looks like I'm not paying attention when Paul's talking. I'm trying to read all the comments and questions here and sort out the ones we're going to get to here. Paul Chadwick says, Jim Shooter once explained Mort Weisinger's management style at a talk I attended by saying, kind of like this, and miming mashing a fly with his thumb. Just as I said at the beginning, how Jerry Siegel was at peace with DC Comics because of a lot of the things Paul and Jeanette did. Mort Weisinger, before he passed away, had gone out and sat down with Jerry, and they'd apologized back and forth for all sorts of things they'd done to each other over the years. And Mort, whatever anger Jerry ever had at Mort was gone by the end. He thought of Mort was a great guy who'd been very good to him over the years, which really surprised me because he didn't think that way in 1969.
I'm happy they made their peace.
Let's see. A couple of these questions would have a lot. Paul Chadwick asks, I'm curious about some of the leading lights of fandom of your vintage who didn't go into comics making. Any tales of what became of Second Message, Alan L. Light, G.B. Love, Martin L. Grime, Bill G. Wilson, Howard Rogowski, the Menominee Falls Gazette guys? Any comments? Well, Howard Rogowski was a dealer. I don't think he ever had any desire to create content. Alan Light sold the Buyer's Guide off and went into other fields, and he's apparently very prosperous in them. G.B. Love passed away. Martin L. Grime, Marty was kind of a sad guy. Marty's eyes began to fail him, and he drew a couple of comic book stories painstakingly, agonizing over every panel, and got a few things published, Thunder Bunny, and he did some things for the Archie superhero line, and then his eyes failed him, and he was not able to do anymore, and he passed away. I don't know about Bill G. Wilson. The Menominee Falls Gazette guys they're doing fine. They're on Facebook a lot, posting great messages and such.
I think one of the things that separates this out, I was a New York kid. I was going to high school in Manhattan, 15 minutes from the DC and Marvel offices. Pretty much all of the New York fans of my generation who loved comics got a shot at getting into the business. Lots of them didn't stay for one reason or another, or stayed for a while and then did other things. I was talking to Steve Mitchell earlier this week because of Marty's death. We were catching up a little bit. Steve worked at DC as a young guy in the production department, worked at Atlas, running their production department for the 2 minutes they were around, became a successful inker for a bunch of years, and then has gone on to a wonderful career in his second love of the world of film. But most of the guys you're talking about, Menominee Falls, Alan Light, Gordon Love, Marty Grime, they weren't New Yorkers. And in the pre-internet era, it was even harder to imagine picking up and moving to New York. And it's, you in those years, you couldn't get into the business otherwise. I think, I don't remember exactly when Paul Chadwick came in. I think it's probably 85, maybe, something like that. By that time, the industry was comfortable with the idea of people out of town. FedEx was working. I guess you had taught us to spend a lot of money on that, Mark.
Actually, Pat said, when I told Pat what it cost to send that package, she said, "We'll never do that. We'll never have that happen."
You should have seen the bills out of her department for that.
There was a wonderful period there where you could mail stuff from Los Angeles to New York overnight if you could get it to the Express Mail Depot by LAX by 10 p.m. So I would be racing out there. This is before fax machines or email. Mm-hmm. And I would get there, and there were about 12 people working for DC at that point from Los Angeles, and I'd get there, and there'd always be four of us there, mailing at 9:58 to DC or Marvel, actually, at both times, at the Express Mail thing. And we'd send this stuff off. And, when you mail off a package, you're rushing to get done. You have this moment of decompression. You just go, big exhale. And we'd all look at each other and someone would say, "Hey, let's go to the strip club down the street." And that was the ritual, things like that for a while there. And then we got fax machines and it ruined all those parties. Let's see. I just had a great message here I just lost it, from Bill Cotter, our friend Bill. "I worked with Paul when I was at Warner's. It was a distinct pleasure working with an exec who actually knew and cared about his products. Many others treated everything as disposable inventory."
Thank you, Bill.
Okay. And another one from Paul Chadwick. "I'm willing to bet Paul's measured, speak no ill personal manner served him well as a boss to the volatile creatives in this business. You want to be a fellow adult around this guy." All right.
I always spoke no ill, but I tried to be patient. I'm human. I lost my temper a bunch of times. There was a broken ceiling tile in my assistant Linda's office for a while, from a time when I had just grabbed her rubber band ball that she had laboriously put together for therapy and was slamming it down on the floor so hard it bounced up and shattered the ceiling tile. But overall, I didn't believe in yelling at people. I never believed somebody should yell at me. If I screwed up, have a conversation with me, tell me what I screwed up. But I never believed I sold somebody the right to yell at me, and I didn't believe people had sold me the right to yell at them. I'm sure I stepped over that line a bunch of times because I'm human, and it was a lot of years. But I never did it intentionally, and never was proud if I had done it.
I saw you once come as close as you did to that because of an artist who had not handed his work and had pretty feeble excuses that were obvious lies, and you were very upset because now you had nothing. The inker was waiting for the pages, and the penciler had screwed up, and now the inker and you had nothing to give to the inker in lieu of work to give in lieu of that. And let's talk about that a minute. Here's a question. I worked for Chase Craig for years. Chase Craig edited as many comic books as any human being who ever lived in this world, practically. He was the editor for Western Publishing for Dell and Gold Key for years. I asked him one time, if your life depended on getting a comic book written and drawn in practically overnight in a hurry, who are the most dependable people you would call on to do this? And he said, well, for the writing, I'd call you, Mark, which I think just meant I'm the one who asked him this question. But he said, Dan Spiegel, or if it needed to be inked, Mike Royer. And I worked with Dan Spiegel, and I absolutely believe that, of course. Dan was the most reliable artist I ever saw in my life. All right, let's say you're editing comics for DC. You can pick any year you want, and they come to you and they say, we need something written and drawn as fast as possible. And I don't mean we're looking at this for speed so much as dependability, somebody who's going to hand it in right. All right, name me a writer and an artist, or an artist combo.
Well, the artists I can certainly name, because for about 5 years I was responsible for DC's deadlines, and one of the things that was a constant conversation, I'd walk into Len Wein's office, who perhaps had the most challenging attitude towards deadlines of our editorial team, in search of quality. And Len wouldn't have the thing ready for the artist, or would still be dallying about who the artist was going to be. I'm sort of, okay, Len, if you don't give it out to somebody, we have to give it out to Dick Ayers. And I would use Dick and Vinny as my death threats, because they were both, remember, we're in the 70s. We're still in a newsstand era of comics, still mostly selling comics to kids. Both of them could do a professional job 100% dependably and very quickly. They were never anybody's first choice, but they were a good safety net in the process. The writing side, I think in those years, Jerry Conway probably would have been the best fast writer in the house of the current generation. Probably.
Okay. Len had a perverse need to always get this book down to the absolute end, and he was like that in his real life sometimes. So if I was meeting Len someplace, he would show up at the last possible moment without causing a problem, like that. Let's talk a little bit about a fellow named Marty Pasko. I wanted to save this for this, who we lost a couple of days ago. I met Marty in 1970 with Alan Brennert, who's remained his best friend to his death, to Marty's passing. Marty worked for you a lot, and you guys worked together an awful lot. Marty's life had taken a very strange turn in the last few years. He was not the happiest guy in the world, but he was produced for some really wonderful work over the years. And I think, he wrote Superman for a long time and wrote it very well. He did a book called Saga of the Swamp Thing, which didn't get much attention because he was following Len Wein and he was preceding Alan Moore. And, and I thought he did a wonderful, wonderful book. If you take them standalone there, and he did a lot of great things for DC and such. Do you have any memories of Marty that you want to share with us?
Well, I mean, we were friends for a very long time. I got to know Marty through his fanzine with Alan, which was one of the handful of fanzines that preceded mine that in some ways I was emulating. Fanzine. They gave up right around the time that I started, but very much the same sort of thing. They were more grown up. They were a little older, and a little made a big difference at that point. Certainly a little more sophisticated in terms of the content they were doing. We became friendly when we were both on staff at DC. When he was working with Julie, I was working with Joe Orlando. We ended up sharing an apartment together for about 2 years when I moved out from home. And during that time, we collaborated on a handful of stories, JLA, JSA, Legion team up. He did some Aquaman work with taking over for me on one thing or another. And we stayed friends for the rest of his life. We worked together a different way. Probably the most impactful work he did in his career was his television work. He did a bunch of live action television, Max Headroom, Roseanne, a stretch on Roseanne as a writer and story editor, Twilight Zone.
Buck Rogers, yeah.
Yeah. And then he really settled in animation, a world you know better than I, but he was working on Batman the Animated Series and the collateral projects to that. And he was the most comic book versed of the team. And it was a team that understood comics well by that point, but he was a little deeper in our world than all of it. So he was a great bridge within that group. And then he came back to DC after the Northridge quake. That really freaked him out. So he wanted to move back to New York. And I was able to get him a job with us doing special projects, doing what we called mass market titles for a while, small editorial group. He did a bunch of really interesting and often weird projects for us. There's a photo of him with Hillary Clinton that got a bunch of pickup tied to his obits. That's from the Landmine books that we produced out of his group. A woman named Dana Curtin was the hands-on editor for most of that. And we all got to go to the White House for the press conference announcing it. Great couple of comics teaching kids not to get blown up. It's in many ways, the best work I was ever associated with. It's the only time I've ever had the pleasure of having somebody tell me they saw something I work on save a life. One of the mayor of one of the towns in Kosovo told me that at the reception. Very wonderful moment. So he did a lot of terrific work. He tended to be someone who was both a perfectionist and a worrier. And he wanted every job to be the best it could be. And that often became a self-defeating issue, either for deadlines or for just smoothness of operation, or just what it took out of him emotionally in the process. And he had a bunch of health problems in the years when he moved back to LA. The combination of all of those things made it certainly a rougher time for him in his last batch of years. But I don't think any of us were expecting him to go. It was very sudden. And it was one of my old poker buddies. And that table's been shrinking in the last few years. We lost Roger Slifer, who co-created Lobo. We lost Len Wein. We lost Marty. All three of them, basically of my generation, our generation. And it's sad.
Well, that happens. You live long enough. You live long enough, and friends die. It's one of those things that's unescapable, and we get depressed about it. But Marty had so much more he could have done and such, but he was not happy the last couple of times I saw him, and he was very troubled. And he had some medical problems, as you said. And I think I'm trying to encourage people to be more accepting of this instead of retreating into everybody I know is dying. Well, eventually everyone will die, and you'll die with them. I'm being silly poetic here a little bit, but Marty left an awful lot of wonderful work, and he had a lot of people who loved his work. There's some wonderful outpourings on Facebook the last couple of days about people remembering their favorite work of his. I wish he could have seen them. I think he would have been surprised by how many people loved his work.
I think he would have been thrilled to see that there was an obit for him in both Hollywood Reporter and Variety. Yeah. I mean, he loved the movie business. He knew an astounding amount about old movies. Loved that field. He never got to play in it. And to see himself recognized and treated with that kind of dignity would have surprised him and pleased him greatly. And you're right, Mark. Look, I've had a long career doing a lot of different things in comics. And there's a handful of people, you've been very kind on many occasions, talking about some of the things I did on the business side of the field. Many of the retailer and distribution people in the business have been very kind to me about that. And I've gotten awards specifically related to that, like the one from Comics Pro some years ago. But the thing that has the most emotional resonance is the people who come up to you and talk to you about the effect your stories had on them. That's part of the glory of writing.
Well, it's interesting. No, no more questions, folks. We're not going to get through the ones you're putting up now. I was going to ask this question here from Kevin Matchstick, and then I was going to tell, so we end on a lighter note here. I thought we'd tell a story about one of your many awards, your Bill Finger, your Bob Clamp Humanitarian Award, okay? But Kevin Matchstick wrote, and fits in right here, of the various projects you've had a creative hand in over the years, which one, or plural, do you most want to be remembered for and why? Leaving aside business stuff for a minute, just as a guy who was an editor or writer on a lot of projects.
I mean, the two pieces of writing that I've done that I think I'm most likely to be remembered for, the Great Darkness Saga and Legion, which maybe was a little ahead of its time in terms of the creative style and dimension that it was working with. So it's endured, and it still gets read. It still stays in print today, which is astounding to me. And The Origin of the Justice Society, which filled in a nice little piece of DC mythology. I'd like to think that there's a next project that people will care about. I was proud of the stuff I did on that Brooklyn Blood series for Dark Horse that got collected as a single volume graphic novel. They're busy developing that for television. The Taschen book, the 75 Years of DC, I think probably will be the thing that will last longest in libraries that I've worked on. But the thing I take joy in the stories, Mark, as a writer and as an editor, we put a little bit of ourselves in whether we intend to or not. Our philosophy of life comes out through the characters. Our politics, not in the sense of Democrat or Republican, but politics in the sense of how we think the world ought to exist, how it ought to run. I discovered years after I was writing The Legion that in the 80s, I had a really significant, maybe disproportionate gay readership. At that point, there were no out gay characters in The Legion. And so at one point, I asked Phil Jimenez, who was a good friend, was a Legion fan in those days, and is a gay man, why? And Phil said, well, the uniforms were cool. But the other thing was, even though there weren't any gay people in it, you were envisioning a future where all sorts of different people were accepted. Blue people, green people, orange people. Well, if blue people and green people and orange people are accepted, they'll accept us too. And as a writer, that gives me joy, because I do believe that about the future. I believe we're not going to get to the future unless we develop tolerance of each other, not just on sexual orientation, on race, on religion, on nerd versus jock, American versus Chinese. We have to get past othering of people. And I think that's in my stories, not because I was preaching, but because part of who I am goes into it. And here was the case where people were seeing it and feeling it and reacting to it. And, besides my children, who are obviously my largest legacy to the future, and my grandson now, the stories are the legacy. And I hope that some people continue to read them and continue to be influenced to them. I'll give you one more short story and then I'll bail on you. I'm crossing Union Square about 4 or 5 years ago, going to an event with Jules Pfeiffer to promote the book on Will Eisner that I did. And I get stopped in the middle of the square by a middle-aged, well-dressed guy who calls me out by name. I'm not enough of a celebrity that things like that happen very often, but once in a long while. And he introduces himself and he says, "Listen, I just want to tell you the sense of justice in your stories," and he also mentions Carrie Bates and Elliot Magen's stories, "gave me my calling. And I'd love to take you to lunch and go all fanboy on you. I'm not crazy. Here's my card." He's the chief diplomat of the Episcopal Church. Who knew the Episcopal Church had a chief diplomat? His job is basically to reach beyond the church to the connections. So we've become friends, and we'll go out to lunch a couple times a year, and he'll tell me about his latest meeting with Pope Francis or being at the royal wedding, and I'll tell him a story about Murphy Anderson. And we have a grand time. And I don't think I gave him his calling. I think he had a sense of justice. I think being a man of faith is a calling, and I think on the good days and for the good people it is. I think that was in him, and whether it came from a higher power or purely came from within him, the most I can believe and claim is that he found a resonance in the stories we were writing that helped move him along to the idea that justice was important in life. And I'm thrilled that he found that resonance. And I'm thrilled with having touched readers along the way. My stories will be remembered long after anyone remembers anything about any deal I ever did, whether it was, helping Jack, helping Jerry, working on the distribution systems,
helping Bill Finger's son, helping Paul Norris, helping a lot of these golden age guys. Okay. Yeah. All right. Fine. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about them.
No, not at all. I mean, I wasn't too great with Bill's son one day. So at the end of his life, he showed up one day desperately needing a check, and I didn't pull a rabbit out of a hat fast enough. And I didn't realize how ill he was. I wasn't astute enough to look and realize that his complexion was an unhealthy jaundice.
You didn't slam the door in his face, which was what some of your predecessors would have done.
Oh God, no. No, I mean, the nicest thing I ever did two things for the Finger family. One, when I was a snot-nosed little kid of 16, Bill came in on a Friday, and as you were talking about it with the story with Murray and Bob Brown, we were able to voucher checks in advance of people delivering. And we had a check in the drawer for 2 6-page scripts, and Bill was only delivering one. And Joe Orlando, my boss, had taken that day off, so it was just me. Bill really said he needed the check for the weekend. I forget what his reasoning was, but he needed it. The rule was you shouldn't give the guy the check for work he wasn't delivering. And this was Bill Finger. Well, on the one hand, this is Bill Finger who co-created Batman and Green Lantern. On the other hand, this is Bill Finger who is famous for having had his grandmother die about 87 times and having the most imaginative excuses for not delivering in the industry's history. I couldn't not give Bill the check. And he came up with the best excuse of his career. He died that weekend. So I ended up having to make up the 6 pages to the company, but I talked Joe into letting me write a superhero story instead of a mystery story, and it became my first superhero story. But the other nice thing that I did for the Finger family is when we finally connected with his granddaughter Athena, and this was, I think, when we were having her out to the premiere of one of the Batman movies. I had taken her out to lunch, and as a kid, I had saved some of the old scripts that the writers had delivered that usually would get thrown out after the art job was delivered and the scripts were proofread. I had saved a couple of Bill's. I was able to give her one of Bill's scripts, which was the only thing she had absolutely nothing of her grandfather, so at least she had a genuine Bill Finger script.
That's nice. That's nice.
I was very happy with how that worked out.
Okay. Well, listen, I want to tell the story about your Bob Clampett award. Would you tell the story, or shall I tell the story?
You should tell the story, Mark.
they have this thing called the Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award. They give every year at Comic-Con. I don't know what you have to do to get it sometimes. I got one, and I'm not sure why. One year, they were giving it to Paul. I knew about it in advance. It is the only award that they present at the Eisner Awards that nobody knows who's going to get it in advance. The other awards are either announced in advance or the nominees are announced in advance. So there's a limit to surprises there. I think maybe the Russ Manning Award. Yeah, the Russ Manning Award has nominees too. But there's no nominees for the Clampett Award. Nobody knows who's going to get it. Paul was sitting there at one table. I was sitting with Ruth Clampett, daughter of Bob, who was going to make the presentation. I look over, and Paul is sitting 2 tables away from us, and he is exhausted. He's been on meetings all day. He is falling asleep, literally at the table. He is nodding off. And I know that the presentation of the Clampett Award is an hour away, because this is back when the ceremonies ran like, mini-series. And I'm watching, and I point out to Ruth, I said, that's the guy over there. That's Paul Levitz you're presenting it to. He's falling asleep. And she goes, what can we do? And I go, I don't know. But anyway, finally, we suddenly see Paul get up, shake hands with everybody at his table. And he's obviously saying, I'm sorry, I can't stay. I got to go hit the sack. I got to go. He starts going out. And we're still 40 minutes from the presentation. So I jump up and I run to the back of the room, and I run out around the other side. And Paul is coming out of the room in the lobby. Do you remember this at all? Am I telling you this? Okay.
I do. The missing piece is that in those years, I generally served as DC's default acceptor of the Eisner Awards. If there wasn't one of the creative people or one of the editors of a title, I was the one who went up and did it. And I've reached the point in tallying the program. Okay, every award that's left, we have one of the people here who can accept. I don't need to be here anymore. So that's why I had picked that particular moment to exit.
Okay. So I stop him. He's leaving. We're in the room outside the hall, and he's walking. I say, where are you going? And Paul says, I'm going to bed. I can't work anymore. And I said, get back in that room. He goes, what? I said, get back in that room. And Paul acts like he's being mugged. He goes, okay, all right, okay. And he goes back in the room, and I ran around, got back to my seat, and I see Paul sit down back at his table that he left. He's going, I don't know why I'm back. He had no idea. And then he proceeded to fall asleep again. And finally, we get to the award, and Ruth gets up there, and she says, tonight we are presenting for the first time the Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award to a man who is the publisher of a comic book company. And I saw Paul go, just wake up suddenly. Going, huh? And she starts saying, and a couple sentences in, it's obvious it's Paul. He figures out it's him because of what she's telling about. And he finally, they announce it's Paul Levitz. The audience breaks into huge applause, cheering this thing. Paul gets up and he's stumbling to the stage, and he's practically crying. And I know it's not because he's moved by the thing. It's because he's so tired he wants to go home. And he got up on stage and made a wonderfully emotional, spontaneous speech. And finally, he staggers off, and it's like, and he was so grateful he could go home. I don't think you cared about the trophy as much as going back to the hotel room and collapsing. But I don't think you fully realized the great ovation you got when your name was mentioned.
Ovation, but I think all I remember of the speech is starting it with, "This must be a mistake." Publishers don't get awards for being good people.
Well, you were saying earlier about Archie Goodwin, and I always thought that one of the things about Archie that made him a great editor was this. If you went up to Archie and said, hey, that book you published last week by Paul Levitz and Mark Evanier was fabulous, we loved it, he would have said, yeah, didn't the guys do a great job on that? Wasn't that terrific? And he wouldn't let on that he had rewritten 2/3 of it and made us rewrite it twice. He would never do that. And if he went to certain other editors we could both name, they would say, oh, God, that was tough. I had to drag that out of them. I had to rewrite a lot of it. God, that was such a pain. I'm glad you liked it because we had to really do a salvage job on that, even if that wasn't true. Archie was completely non-competitive. He did not take bows for things that he didn't even take bows for things he deserved bows for, let alone for other people's work. And he came at the work with no ego involved with it and no expectation that he was going to get. He knew that the editor is frequently the forgotten person on the comic, and the publisher is frequently the forgotten person on the comic also. And some publishers and people in your job, Paul, have been very proactive. They had a lot to do with shaping the material. Some, of course, don't even read the material. But one of the things that you're good at, and we're very good at when you're doing this full time, was sharing credit and not feeling competitive with the people that you were working with. And that's why people liked working with you, because there is some, again, we could both mention some names, but there are writers who just, don't know how to do that, and editors who don't know how to do that and such. So, credit is something you should be giving away as much as you should be getting in this business. So anyway, I want to thank you, Paul, for spending this time with us. We're going to let you go to bed now because you're obviously tired. It's late where you are, but we got through about a tenth of the stuff I wanted to talk about. So maybe we'll do another one of these someday. And I thank all the people who tuned in. For those of you who are interested, this Saturday at 1 o'clock in this space, I'll be doing the second of our cartoon voice panels. We've got a terrific lineup of people. If you saw the first one, you're going to want to see the second one. If you didn't see the first one, go watch it, and then you'll want to watch the second one. It's on the same channel here. Next week, I'm going to be doing, on Tuesday, an interview with Scott Shaw. We're going to be talking about the early days of the San Diego Con and about working at Hanna-Barbera together. On Thursday, I'm going to be talking with a lady named Sherry Steinkellner, who's one of the best comedy writer producers in the business. I worked with her on Cheers. She and her husband wrote the musical Sister Act. They wrote the book for the musical Sister Act. They did the TV show Teacher's Pet. They worked on The Jeffersons. They worked on the Bob show. I worked with them on that when Bob Newhart was a comic book artist. And she's just done all sorts of amazing things, and you'll love her. And the following weeks, until I get really bored with this, I've got coming up, I've got interviews with Steve Stollier, with Jeff Altman, with Leonard Maltin. I got lots of friends who are worthy of talking to for 90 minutes. I will not run out for a long time. I'll probably get bored with this before I do. Thank you once again, Paul. Thank you all for joining us. If you came in late, this interview will repeat in the same spot in a couple of minutes on YouTube. And I'll see some of you on Saturday. Thank you. Goodbye.
Take care, all.